Welcome back to Native American history. In this episode, we link diary lines and maps to see a community forced to move and how they survived. September 1838, Twin Lakes, Indiana. Corn stands high around a mission chapel and 100 log houses. Before sunrise, riders appear on the road. Militiamen form a ring. Headmen are called to a council and held. Outside families are told to prepare to move west. The scene is orderly and tense, more ledger than battlefield, yet its consequences will run for generations. This story follows a single column of people across 61 days, from Indiana to Sugar Creek in present-day Kansas. The principal actors are clear: the Twin Lakes Potawatomi under Menominee, who had long insisted their reserve was promised to them. Indiana volunteers raised under the direction of John Tipton to enforce removal after treaty deadlines passed. A federal agent, William Polk, tasked to organize the train and keep the roll. A young priest, Benjamin Petit, who will record births, baptisms, illnesses, and deaths along the road. Behind them stand earlier commissioners and treaties, including Abel C Pepper, and the agreements concluded in 1836. The dates are fixed. The places are still on the map: Logansport, Danville, Naples, Quincy, Osawatomie. Each will become a camp name and later a stone marker. Each day will have a distance and a ration issue. Each halt will test the limits of food, water, shelter, and strength. The central question is plain: how did a reserve recognized on paper turn into a march managed as a campaign? Which orders, signatures, and decisions set it in motion? And why did no intervention stop it once begun? A second question follows: why does this route still echo across county lines and parish records today? We begin at Twin Lakes because that is where the column formed, the doors closed on the council, and the first steps were taken under guard. June 1830, Washington City. The Indian Removal Act passes and sets a national framework for negotiated cessions west of the Mississippi River. Administration of treaties and removals sits under the War Department through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The policy establishes leverage that will reach the small reserve at Twin Lakes. October 1832, Twin Lakes, Indiana. A treaty confirms a local reserve for Menominee's band after broader Potawatomi cessions in the Great Lakes. The promise is a fixed homeland near the mission and fields already under cultivation. The reserve exists on paper but is surrounded by new survey lines. September 1833, Chicago. Potawatomi leaders sign large cessions that accelerate settlement in northern Indiana and Illinois. Some bands agree to remove west on a future schedule. Menominee's band remains tied to the 1832 reserve and does not accept wholesale migration. The gap between instruments sets up later conflict. 1834 to 1835. Northern Indiana. Pressures mount along planned corridors. The Michigan Road Project requires clear title across Potawatomi country. Surveyors cut section lines toward new counties and town plats. State officials receive petitions from settlers to extinguish remaining enclaves. Parish missions expand baptismal rolls and school lists in the same period. Two parallel systems grow in one landscape. August 5, 1836. Yellow River, Indiana. United States Commissioner Abel C Pepper concludes an agreement to cede the Menominee Reserve and move the band west within 2 years. Signatory chiefs include leaders from neighboring groups. Menominee disputes the authority and withholds his assent. The instrument is proclaimed in early 1837 and becomes the state's operational basis. The clock begins. Late 1836 to 1837. Indianapolis and Logansport. Indiana officials translate the treaty into action plans. Road segments are budgeted. County seats plan for land sales once the reserve clears. The federal agent system prepares annuity and equipment schedules for a removal in 1838. Menominee submits a written protest dated November 1837, asserting fraud and lack of consent. The protest does not suspend enforcement. Winter 1837 to spring 1838. Twin Lakes. The band plants and tends fields as in prior years. The mission remains active. Delegations travel to press for reconsideration. No new federal instrument is issued to modify the 1836 terms. Local settlers increase grazing and fencing around the reserve margins. Tensions rise over hunting access and timber cutting. Summer 1838. Indianapolis. Governor David Wallace receives updates that the 2-year term has expired. General John Tipton, a militia leader with frontier experience, is tasked to assemble volunteers. Orders specify the seizure of headmen to prevent dispersal. A federal agent, William Polk, is identified to manage the train and keep the official roll. Contracts are arranged for wagons, teams, rations, and ferries along the projected line of march. Late August 1838. Tipton marches north with mounted volunteers. The column's objectives are fixed: secure the leaders, encircle the settlement, record every household on a muster, destroy standing crops to deter return, move the entire band to a staging point at Logansport, and hand over to the federal agent for the westward route. Constraints include short lead time, late summer heat, and reliance on local contractors for transport. Logistics assume 20 to 30 wagons teams sufficient for daily movement and ration issues of flour, pork, coffee, and salt by head count. For the Twin Lakes Potawatomi, the objectives differ. Maintain the reserve recognized in 1832. Avoid dispersal into small groups that can be more easily compelled. Protect children, elders, and stores laid in for the harvest. Seek clerical or federal mediation to pause enforcement until protests are heard. Constraints are severe. There is no recognized armed force. Ammunition and arms are limited and under watch. The fields are fixed assets that cannot move. The leadership is exposed to arrest if a council is called under state authority. Logistics are household-based and seasonal, with corn nearly ready for harvest and limited draft animals owned by families. Immediate triggers fall in sequence. The treaty deadline passes in August. A summons to a council is issued for early September. Headmen are detained when they arrive. Militia rings are thrown around the village paths and lanes. Disarmament is partial but effective because surprise and numbers favor the volunteers. The chapel is shut. The village is marked for demolition after departure to deny winter shelter to anyone who slips the roll. Administrative structure shapes the tempo. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is still under the War Department, so correspondence and supply draw on Army practices. March rates and ration tables follow military norms. State volunteers answer to Tipton on the ground and coordinate with the federal agent for record-keeping and provisioning. Parish authority remains limited to pastoral care. Father Benjamin Petit will act within that narrow lane and record events rather than halt them. By September 3rd, the plan becomes movement. Wagons stand in rows near the mission. Names are called and written down. The escort posts an advance guard and a rear guard. The route is set through Logansport toward Illinois River ferries and Mississippi steamboats identified in advance. The Potawatomi have one tactical choice left: keep families together inside the official train to preserve life and witness, or break away into small groups and risk pursuit without food or shelter. Most choose to stay in column. The causes have converged into a schedule. The buildup has turned into a road. September 4th, 1838. Twin Lakes, Indiana. Menominees band under Indiana. Volunteers and federal agent William Polk. Dawn is cool and still. Within an hour, the perimeter tightens. Couriers ride between pickets and the mission yard, where headmen remain under guard. Interpreters move household to household with the roll. Families are given minutes to gather blankets, kettles, and a little cornmeal. Militiamen fire the first rows of standing corn to prevent any return after departure. The first displacements occur before the column even forms. A dozen elderly are placed on wagons. Mothers with infants are assigned near the center. Several young men slip away toward the tree line and are pursued by mounted details, but not found before the step-off. By late morning, the escort divides into advance guard, main body, and rear guard, and the road toward Logansport fills with dust. Heat builds. Children cough. At the first noon halt, ration issues begin: flour, pork, coffee, salt, measured head by head. The signal system is simple and effective: a bugle for march, a shouted tally for rations, and riders sent down the line to relay changes in pace or direction. Father Benjamin Petit catches the column within days and begins to record baptisms and deaths, adding a second ledger to the official roll. September 17-22, 1838. Catlin and Sidney and Sedoris, Illinois. Polk's train under escort parish aid intermittent. The second week brings fatigue and illness. The weather remains hot by day and cool by night. Dust hangs over prairie roads where wagons cut ruts beside hedgerows and creek crossings. At Sandusky Point near Catlin, the escort halts 3 days to regroup. Couriers sent ahead return with news that ferries at Naples on the Illinois River can be hired, but will require careful staging and daylight hours. The delay helps the escort mend harness and check wheels. It hurts the column's health. Shallow wells near camp go foul. Diarrhea and fever spread among children. On September 21st, at Sidney, a chief named in the rolls as Mukosis dies, followed by a child the same day. The escort detail assigns an extra wagon to the sick list. On September 22nd, at Sedoris Grove, discipline phrase. A civilian wagoner is dismissed for drunkenness after nearly overturning a team. 2 Potawatomi men accused of leaving the line without permission to look for game are held under guard until evening. Interpreters struggle to keep pace with orders delivered in quick bursts. A half day is lost to confusion at a fork in the road until a mounted courier finds the correct crossing downstream. The immediate effect is visible in the people walking more bare feet, more makeshift bandages around ankles, more mothers lifting children onto wagons when the grade steepens. The escort's solution is blunt, shorter stages, tighter control at halts, and a ban on off-column foraging except under armed supervision. October 3-4, 1838, Naples, Illinois. River ferry crisis, under time pressure and weather shift. By early October, the column reaches the Illinois River opposite Naples. Low clouds and wind signal a change of season. The crossing is the first true logistics choke point. Flatboats and keelboats are scarce. A steamboat upriver is hired but cannot come alongside until late morning. The escort establishes a loading order, first the sick and infants with mothers, then elders, then wagons in rotation, then the remaining families. The river takes 9 hours to cross in repeated trips. Each trip requires unyoking teams stripping wagons to lighten them and careful balancing on wet planks. A courier rides back to the last camp, with instructions to hold stragglers until daylight. On the near bank, rain begins. On the far bank, the first cold gusts arrive. 2 children die during the 2-day halt. The ferry crews ask for payment before the final trips. Polk negotiates with promissory notes and a list of federal vouchers to be redeemed. The escort posts pickets to prevent men from attempting their own crossings on found skiffs. Signal flags improvised from blankets on poles are used to call the next load forward over the noise of water and wind. When the last wagon comes ashore on October 4th, the column's shoes are soaked, blankets are damp, and coughs carry down the line. October 8-10, 1838, Quincy, Mississippi River, steamboat passage and morale balance under parish cover. 4 days later, the column reaches Quincy. The Mississippi is broader, the banks more crowded. Parish clergy arrange Sunday services and a little bread for the sick. The escort allows a pause that steadies morale. A hired steamboat takes on the first groups, while wagons and teams wait on the levee. Telegraph lines new to the region do not yet connect these river towns. Coordination still depends on riders and word of mouth. That absence of instant signaling forces conservative choices. No night crossings, no splitting of the column beyond the ferry queue, and strict head counts before each departure. The weather turns wet and chilly. Mothers wrap infants in doubled shawls. Older children cluster near wagon tongues to get out of the wind. A team breaks a trace on the landing, and a wagon lurches. No one is injured, but the scare brings the escort to a halt while harness is repaired. On the Missouri side, the terrain changes, longer intervals between farms and wells, more open prairie, fewer established roads. The daily distances shorten and the sick list grows. Stragglers are pulled back into line by mounted details before nightfall. Many of the children, exhausted by fatigue and heat by day and chilled by the night, succumb despite our care. I baptized them on the road. Some died the same evening. We lack shoes and blankets. The mothers go on foot. Benjamin Petit letter near Osage River, Indian Country, November 1838. Late October 1838. Central Missouri, cold rain and exposure, compound losses, past the Mississippi. Crossing the column faces the first sustained cold snap. Rain slants across open ground and pools in wheel ruts. Fires sputter in the wind. Shoes fail in numbers. The escort orders rawhide thongs cut to bind soles to feet until replacements can be found in the next town. But towns grow sparse. At several camps, forage parties return with little, beyond a few ears of late corn and a thin steer bought at a high price from a settler. A courier sent ahead to confirm a planned ferry returns after dark, with word of low water on a tributary. The column must detour upstream to a better ford, adding miles to the day and pushing the rear guard into camp by lantern light. Interpreters work constantly because orders now change hour by hour, short halts to squeeze between squalls, then long halts to dry blankets and warm the sick when the rain lifts. Exposure becomes the enemy. Infants and the elderly are carried more often. Mothers sleep sitting up to keep children off the ground. The escort's discipline remains intact, but its own men show strain. 2 are left at a farmstead with fevers. 1 teamster's hands split and bleed in the wet cold. Each day's ledger records another grave. November 4th, 1838, Oak Grove to Sugar Creek, present-day Kansas, final push and arrival under mission authority. On November 8th, the column passes Oak Grove and turns toward Bull Creek and the Osage River country. The weather clears for a window of hard marching. Polk and the escort officers press the pace to reach shelter before the next front. Couriers ride ahead to the Sugar Creek mission to signal the approaching train and request space and supplies. The response comes back by mounted messenger mid-afternoon with a simple message: shelter will be found, but the numbers are greater than expected. That night, the column camps on hard ground within a day of the mission. The sick list is read, the names of the dead to date are repeated in a low voice for the record. On November 4th, the column enters the Sugar Creek area. A mission priest and the local Indian agent meet the head of the column. The escort forms a cordon while families are shown to temporary encampments near timber and water. 756 people remain on the roll. The march ends, the consequences begin. September 3-4, 1838, Twin Lakes, Indiana. The enforcement sequence begins at first light and moves by the book. The escort has a simple order of battle. General John Tipton commands mounted volunteers raised in northern Indiana. An advance guard screens roads to the north and east. The main body forms around 26 wagons with teams an ambulance wagon for the sick and a small reserve of pack animals. A rear guard closes gates and keeps stragglers in line. William Polk, acting as the federal agent on the ground, keeps the official roll and directs issues of flour pork coffee and salt by head count. Interpreters move between officers and families. Parish figures stand to the side with their own lists and sacraments. The rules are spoken plainly to company officers the night before the arrests. Detain the headmen at a council. Prevent dispersal. Admit no firearms in the crowd. Fire no shots unless met with force. Destroy standing crops after departure to deny shelter and supplies to anyone who slips the roll. The arrest authority rests on the treaty proclaimed earlier in 1837 and on state instructions transmitted to Tipton in the summer of 1838. The scope is limited to the Twin Lakes Reserve and adjacent settlements that feed into it. The objective is to deliver the entire band to Logansport and then on to the federal route west. First contact is a summons to a council near the mission chapel. When Menominee and other leaders arrive, the doors close and guards take position. A short line follows in a captain's hand. Proceed without delay. Suffer no dispersion. It reads like a march order because that is what it is. From arrest to assembly, the maneuvers are administrative. A cordon is thrown around lanes between the chapel houses and fields. Riders post at the tree line where young men might try to slip out. Interpreters call household heads to the roll. Where names are missing, the roll keeper writes by description. No one is permitted to sort stored grain beyond a sack or two. Near midday on September 4th, the column steps off toward Logansport. The escort divides into the same three parts. It will keep for 2 months advance guard, main body, rear guard. The road is dry and rutted. The first choke points are narrow bridges across small creeks where only one wagon can pass at a time. The command learns to meter the flow, to hold the rear until the head clears the span, and to keep families grouped. Resistance takes the form that the situation allows. Menominee refuses to assent to removal even under guard. Several young men escape into the timber and are not found that day. There are no skirmishes. There is watchfulness, grief, and argument. Requests are made for delay until harvest can be brought in. They are denied with the same answer each time the term in the treaty has expired. The band must move west. A second line shorter than the first appears in an officer's after-action note at Logansport: no arms drawn. Column formed as ordered. It tells the truth but leaves out the smoke that drifted from the fields put to the torch. From Logansport to the Wabash crossings, the path is a procession of small decisions under policy pressure. The escort keeps march rates of 6 to 12 miles per day depending on hills, creek crossings, and the capacity of the slowest wagons. Ration issues follow a schedule to prevent hoarding and to keep the line moving. The quartermasters record shortages of shoes and blankets within the first week. The march touches county seats that will later host marker stones: Danville, Catlin, Sidney, Sodorus, Monticello. Each halt is chosen for water and timber and for distance to the next known farm or ferry. Each departure is called by bugle and by a shouted count down the line. Signals and delays matter because telegraph lines do not yet connect the route. Everything moves by courier. When word must go forward to arrange a boat or a ferry, a mounted man rides and returns with a written note or a verbal promise. Where an interpreter is needed, movement slows. 2 languages mean every order takes twice the time unless an interpreter rides at the officer's side. On several days, that small fact costs an hour at a fork or a creek where a local guide must be found. The law moves at the speed of horses and human breath. Casualty ranges recorded along the route are sober and specific. By the end of the crossing at Naples on the Illinois River, multiple children have died of fever and exhaustion. At the halt near Quincy, 2 days on the levee add coughs and chills to a sick list that rarely shrinks. The total loss over the 61 days is recorded later as 42 deaths, most of them children, against an initial roll of 859 and an arrival count near 756. Those figures trace to the missionaries' letters to the agent's roll and to later compilers of county and parish records. Estimates vary at the margins. The pattern does not. The river crossings are the largest choke points and the best measure of logistics stress. At Naples on October 3rd and 4th, the escort spends 9 hours ferrying across the Illinois River. The sequence is repeated a week later at the Mississippi opposite Quincy, with steamboat help, but tighter supervision on the levee. Wagons are stripped to lighten loads. Teams are unyoked and led separately. Mothers with infants load first, then elders, then those too sick to walk. On both rivers, the escort posts pickets to prevent men from attempting private crossings on skiffs when impatience runs high. Payment becomes a question on the far bank. The agent offers vouchers to be redeemed later, and ferry masters accept on the promise of federal credit. Any delay threatens the entire plan because cold weather closes in from the north. Pace is not just a preference, it is a survival requirement. Non-combatants and humanitarian outcomes are the center of the daily ledger. The escort does not treat the column like prisoners of war. It treats them like a train to be delivered intact, yet the result is still a string of graves. Parish care remains steady where clergy are present. Bread is given at Quincy. Mass is said on a Sunday. Baptisms are recorded that are followed by burials on the same page. The escort enforces bans on off-column foraging except under supervision to prevent conflict with farms along the route. That rule protects settlers and the column alike, but it also prevents hungry families from finding extra food when issues run short. It is a policy choice with human cost. The law shapes the road in ways that are visible in the record. The treaty clock started by signatures at Yellow River in August 1836 and proclaimed in early 1837 frames every decision. State authority exercised through Tipton's volunteers provides the muscle to start the column. Federal authority in the person of Polk and in the supply contracts signed ahead of time provides the food, the wagons, and the ferries that keep the column moving. Parish authority ministers to the sick and bears witness. There is no court on the roadside. Objections and protests lodged in 1837 lie unanswered in files far from the dust of September 1838. Administrative continuity matters. The Bureau of Indian Affairs still sits under the War Department, so the march inherits Army forms rations by head guards at night, daily distance targets, and a log of sick and dead. Negotiation beats occur, but do not change the outcome. When the column halts 3 days near Catlin to mend harness and wait for word from the Illinois River leaders, ask again for more time or for release of the headmen. The answer is the same as at Twin Lakes: carry on. At Quincy, when parish clergy organize bread for the weakest, the escort allows a longer Sunday pause. That pause is humane and tactical. Morale improves and the line tightens for the next run. When weather turns in late October across central Missouri, the escort approves shorter stages and more frequent halts to dry blankets. The change saves lives at the margin but slows progress. That trade is logged without sentiment, miles lost to rain. 2 more graves by a creek bed. 1 team purchased from a settler at a high price to replace an animal that breaks down. 2 short fragments capture the tone of enforcement and reflection. An order carried by a company lieutenant near Logansport: hold the prisoners secure, prevent escape, keep good order in the line. An after-action sentence in a missionary letter written weeks later near the Osage. Many of the little ones died on the road despite all we could do. The first speaks the language of policy and control. The second records the cost. Fact and folklore diverge at several points in later retellings. Some narratives say that Menominee refused food for long periods in protest. The journals that survive do not quantify such refusals, and the safe ground is to say his protest was sustained and visible while under guard. Accounts differ on how completely the village at Twin Lakes was burned. Contemporary notes clearly mention crops fired and houses left unusable, but the scope of destruction varies by witness. The firm points remain: headmen were detained under guard at the chapel. A roll of 859 was taken. Crops were destroyed to prevent return. The column moved under escort to Logansport and then west by a route planned in advance. Across the seasons of that single autumn, the policy path becomes a landscape path. September brings heat and dust and the first graves by small Indiana creeks. Early October brings river bottlenecks and the first cold winds across Illinois bottoms. Late October brings rain across the Missouri prairies that soaks shoes and blankets and lungs. Early November brings a clear window of hard marching to reach the Sugar Creek Mission before the next front. At the end, 756 stand at the mission while rations are set and temporary shelter is assigned near timber and water. The escort forms a final cordon and then turns back east. The confrontation is complete not because shots were fired, but because administrative power moved a community across 660 miles and 61 days and left a chain of graves that can be traced on a modern map. October 8, 1838, Quincy, Mississippi River. With the Illinois River behind them and the Mississippi ahead, the column reaches the hinge of the journey. On September 20th, General John Tipton had turned back with most of the militia. Federal Agent William Polk now carries the responsibility to deliver 756 people to Sugar Creek before hard weather closes the prairies. The objective is narrow and unforgiving. Keep the train intact through 2 ferry systems, hold discipline without a large military reserve, and maintain enough calories and dry blankets to prevent a surge in deaths among children and elders. Constraints multiply. Pork and flour are finite and must be guarded. Shoes are failing. Telegraphy does not yet tie these river towns together, so every arrangement still moves by courier and word of mouth. Weather shifts to cold rain and wind along the levee, and the first sustained coughs echo down the line. The immediate effect of a successful Mississippi crossing is decisive. Once on the Missouri bank, escape paths shrink, local allies thin out, and the column's options compress to a single axis southwest. Initiative moves to the escort and the agent's ledger. Ferry order is ruthless for good reason. First, the infants with mothers, then the sick, then elders, then wagons stripped to lighten the load. The steamboat captain demands assurance of payment. Polk answers with federal vouchers. Pickets post along the levee to prevent attempted crossings on skiffs. Every hour on the landing is a trade between exposure and progress. When the last wagon comes off the deck, the column has cleared the largest natural barrier between Twin Lakes and Sugar Creek. The balance tips. A second turn takes shape on the open Missouri prairie between October 12th and October 22. The escort changes tempo from long Illinois halts to shorter, colder pushes bracketed by rain and wind. March tables adjust downward to protect the sick list, but the daily goal remains the same: close distance before the next front. Interpreters ride constantly because orders change with the weather, move when squalls break, stop to dry blankets when gusts slacken. Exposure becomes the primary enemy. Mothers double shawls around infants. Men bind rawhide thongs to ruined souls. Camp names: Seas Creek, Keatsville. DeWitt enter the journals with notes on water forage and the day's graves. The command problem no longer resembles an arrest operation. It has become a winter avoidance race across sparse settlements. Who carries authority at the moment of turning is clear. Polk keeps the roll in ration issues. Company officers manage advance guard and rear guard. Parish clergy, steady morale, and record sacraments. The rules of movement that began under Tipton survive the handoff because the policy framework has not changed. The treaty clock has run out, the state-initiated force to compel departure, and the federal agent will deliver the emigrating party to the assigned mission. With rivers crossed and militia reduced, enforcement shifts from threatened force to control of food ferries and pace. An admission against interest from the man who began the operation marks the legal core of that control. They were not allowed to leave until matters were amicably settled. John Tipton, Report Twin Lakes, August 1838. That sentence, preserved in later summaries, acknowledges detention under color of a chapel meeting and confirms that consent was not the operative mechanism once the council convened. It also explains why the crossing at Quincy matters so much. By the time the column reaches the Mississippi, the decisive legal and physical acts: detention of headmen, destruction of crops, formation of the roll, have already closed most exits. The river crossing simply locks the gate behind them. Evidence on casualties and pace around the turning point is specific. During the Illinois and Mississippi ferries, deaths among children continue, then momentarily ease as the column enters Missouri and is permitted to hunt in intervals. A week later, cold rain returns and losses rise again. A short diary line written after a day of 18 miles sums up the ledger logic of the train. Food issued, forage gathered, one child dead before nightfall, without rhetoric and without the comfort of euphemism. The numbers remain within the ranges recorded at the finish: 42 deaths in 61 days against an initial roll of 859, most of them children, with 756 on arrival. The turning point is measured not in a single dramatic spike, but by the moment the column clears its last strategic barrier and the escort controls every mile to the mission. A brief counterfactual bounded by the record clarifies the stakes. Had high water or mechanical failure delayed the Mississippi crossing, a full week in wet, cold exposure, deaths would likely have risen among infants and elders, as later days in October show. Had parish and town aid at Quincy failed or been refused by the escort morale, and calories would have dipped on the eve of the hardest march, with predictable effects on the sick list. Neither alternative changes the core path shaped by treaty and orders, but both would have worsened the human ledger. For those inside the march, the turning point reads as names, not abstractions. Chief Menominee remains under watch and refuses to concede legitimacy to the removal. Chief Menominee dies near Sydney on September 21st. Father Benjamin Petit, age 27, writes baptisms and burials in the same hand, that will fail him by February in St. Louis. Mothers carry infants through rain to the ferry queue at Quincy. A camp christened Hobson's Choice enters the journal with a flat report of one child's death that day. The winter count motif, the year named by a remembered loss, emerges in family stories that later retrace the stones along the route. Synthesis returns to the structural forces that set this moment in motion. The Yellow River Treaty of August 1836, proclaimed in early 1837, started a 2-year clock that Indiana officials fully intended to keep. The state's objectives were to clear title along surveyed roads and settlements. The federal agent's mandate was to translate that policy into wagons, rations, ferries, and miles. The Potawatomi objective hold, the 1832 reserve, collapsed once the council became detention and the crops were destroyed. When Tipton turned the train over to Polk and the column cleared the Mississippi, the campaign ceased to be about whether removal would occur and became only about how many would survive to Sugar Creek. That is the turn that still echoes. A policy clock matured into an escort schedule. A riverbank became a one-way gate, and a community's fate narrowed to the arithmetic of food, weather, and distance. November 4th, 1838, Sugar Creek, Kansas. The escort reads out the roll and hands responsibility to the local Indian agent and the Jesuit mission. 756 people remain from the 859 who left Twin Lakes. What follows is administration rations, shelter boundaries, and then decades of additional moves that turn a 2-month march into a long policy arc. Law and administration come first. The emigrants are placed on the Sugar Creek Reserve, defined in earlier Potawatomi arrangements, with the agent keeping annuity and ration accounts by household. Parish records and the letters of Father Benjamin Petit confirm immediate issues of flour and pork, and the establishment of temporary camps near timber and water while winter shelters are raised. Petit Letters, Indiana Historical Society, 1906. Within a few years, federal policy consolidates multiple Great Lakes bands into a single reserve farther west along the Kansas River. The Treaty of 1846 sets the framework for what is called the Potawatomi Nation in Kansas, with the St. Mary's Mission as a hub for ration schooling and record-keeping. Treaty of 1846 U.S. Statutes at Large. In 1850, the Sugar Creek mission buildings burn, accelerating the shift towards St. Mary's. Jesuit mission books record the transfer of families and the start of a school regimen tied to rations. St. Mary's Mission registers Kansas. The Treaty of 1861 divides the nation's legal path. Those who accept individual allotments and the option of United States citizenship become known as the Citizen Band. Those who retain a common reservation remain as the Prairie Band Treaty of 1861 U.S. Statutes at Large. A final major relocation begins in 1867 when the Citizen Band purchases land in Indian Territory. The citizen Potawatomi migrates south through the 1870s to what is now Central Oklahoma Citizen Potawatomi Nation Archives. The Prairie Band stay in Kansas, anchored north of Topeka, with a reservation that survives statehood and later allotment pressures. Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation Council records. Land and resource pressures shape each stage. In Indiana, the Michigan Road and County Plats helped drive the 1838 departure. In Kansas, rail surveys and farm expansion frame the 1850s and 1860s boundary disputes. Agent correspondence and general land office plats show leases for grazing and small mill sites along the Kansas River, together with recurring conflicts over timber access that required permits after 1854. Bureau of Indian Affairs, letter books, Kansas Agency. Where rail spurs approached reservation edges in the late 19th century, right-of-way negotiations converted into cash annuities at rates set in Washington, often below local valuations. House Executive Documents on Indian Affairs, 1870s. The policy logic remained constant: define a boundary count, households issue goods, and open adjacent tracts to settler markets. Demography and health follow the ledgers. Parish and agency rolls for the late 1830s and 1840s show high child mortality in the first winters at Sugar Creek and then at St. Mary's. Measles and respiratory disease recur in the record St. Mary's Mission registers. BIA agency reports. Annual abstracts. Baptismal and burial entries sometimes share a page reflecting the same pattern Father Petit had noted on the road. Later federal Indian Office census schedules from the 1870s to the 1890s show gradual population stabilization for the Prairie Band in Kansas, while Citizen Band lists in Indian Territory grow through family reunifications and new arrivals from Great Lakes kin who chose the allotment path. Annual Indian Census rolls, National Archives. Birth rates recover slowly. Epidemics punctuate the decades, with smallpox scares noted in agency letters in the early 1860s. School policy becomes a second road. At St. Mary's in the 1840s and 1850s, Mission schooling ties to food distribution attendance records often ride alongside ration logs, St. Mary's mission registers. After 1884, Haskell Institute at Lawrence, Kansas, draws Potawatomi children into a federal boarding school system designed to replace language and ceremony with English and manual training. Haskell's early catalogs and superintendent reports list Potawatomi enrollments from both the Prairie Band and the Citizen Band Haskell Institute annual reports. The administrative structure is explicit agency rules, not family choice control placements for many years. Cultural continuance persists inside those constraints. The autonym used here, Osawatomie, appears without diacritics in 19th century English language records and names the people as keepers of the fire. Seasonal movements do not vanish. They compress within boundaries and along railroad timetables. Ceremonies shift location rather than vanish outright, appearing in missionary complaints about absences during planting and harvest, and in later ethnographers' notes on gatherings in Kansas river bottoms, and later in Oklahoma Cross Timbers, Jesuit correspondence, 1850s. Smithsonian Bureau of American Ethnology notes, language work survives in family circles and resurfaces in 20th century church and community publications that print Potawatomi prayers and word lists alongside English parish newsletters at St. Mary's, early Citizen Band journals. The winter count motif naming a year by a remembered death or event appears in oral histories attached to the 1838 route where families mark the year of the river crossing, or the year the shoes failed, and tie those phrases to graves listed on later maps, County Historical Society, oral histories along the trail of death. Memory work becomes geographic. Beginning in the late 19th century and expanding in the 20th county, committees and tribal descendants mark campsites and deaths across Indiana and Illinois and Missouri. The modern chain of stones is summarized in the Historical Marker Database and in county centennial pamphlets that reproduce the old route list's HMDB Trail of Death series. Cass and Sangamon County booklets. Parish registers at Quincy St. Boniface preserve the October 1838 pause, with notes on aid and services, St. Boniface Parish Chronicle, Quincy. In Logansport, the remains of Father Petit are returned and interred in a memorial chapel in 1850. And pilgrims from Potawatomi communities visit during commemorative years Logansport Memorial records. Since the 1980s, organized caravans retrace the 61-day route at intervals, reading names at marked camps and updating plaques. Programs and route guides print the same place names that march across the old journals, Trail of Death Association route guides. Present-day continuance is institutional and public. The Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation is headquartered near Mayetta, Kansas, with governmental, judicial, and health services on reservation land. Its language program publishes lessons and runs community classes that standardize an ASCII orthography for online use. Prairie Band Language Program Materials. The Citizen Potawatomi Nation is headquartered near Shawnee, Oklahoma, operating cultural, language, and history centers. These centers and archiving 19th century allotment files that link families back to Kansas and before Citizen Potawatomi Nation Cultural Heritage Center. In the Great Lakes, the Pokagon Band in southwest Michigan and northern Indiana maintains governmental services and a robust language curriculum. The Nottawasepi Huron Band Gun, Lake Band Forest County, Potawatomi, and Hannahville community each maintain health education and cultural programs rooted in local homelands, tribal government sites, and annual reports. Across these governments, legal work continues on land and resource access, rights-of-way timber permits, water quality, and on the protection of burial sites along the 1838 corridor under state and federal statutes, Tribal Historic Preservation Office filings, state archaeology bulletins. The administrative logic that drove the 1838 removal treaty clocks, state enforcement federal logistics, reappears in later forms, allotment ledgers, school registers, right-of-way plats. The counter logic is the record kept from within parish books, agent rolls annotated with tribal names, oral histories fixed to specific creeks and groves, and the stones along county roads. Each of the records cited here ties a line from policy to place the Petit letters and Polk's roll for the winter of 1838 to 1839, the treaties of 1846 and 1861 for consolidation and division in Kansas, the St. Mary's and Quincy Parish registers for schooling and aid, the Indian Office census rolls for population shifts, the HMDB marker series for present-day geography, and tribal archives in Kansas and Oklahoma for the continuance of Osawatomie governance and language. What began as a column under guard ends as a set of institutions that keep names, teach children mark graves, and speak for land and water in courtrooms and council houses. The road from Twin Lakes to Sugar Creek did not erase the people who walked it. It relocated them and forced them to rebuild under a different clock. The evidence still sits in ledgers and stones, and the communities who carry that evidence forward remain where the records say they are on the Kansas prairie, in central Oklahoma, and in the Great Lakes homelands, speaking for their own continuance. Across the literature, three conclusions recur. First, the 1838 removal from Twin Lakes was a planned administrative operation executed under state and federal authority, not a spontaneous migration. Orders, rolls, wagon contracts, and ferry hires gave it the structure of a campaign. Second, the documentary record is unusually dense for a forced removal of this scale. The missionaries' letters and agents' roll parish notes and later county markers fix dates, places, and deaths with uncommon precision. Third, the outcome reshaped Potawatomi life for generations. Communities were compelled from northern Indiana into Kansas, then divided by later treaties into Prairie Band in Kansas and Citizen Potawatomi in Indian Territory, where new institutions, missions, schools, councils were built under pressure. Points of debate are narrower and revolve around instruments and margins. Scholars disagree on the standing of the 1836 Yellow River Agreement over Menominee's 1832 reserve, and on whether consent to the 1836 cession was valid for the Twin Lakes Band. Accounts differ on the degree of physical destruction at the village crops were certainly fired. The extent of house burning varies by witness. Death counts on the road are bounded by named entries, but may omit unrecorded losses. The figure commonly cited rests on the surviving journals and later compilers. Some writers frame the operation as a lawful execution of treaty terms. Others read it as a coerced transfer under color of law, whose effects match what later generations would call ethnic cleansing. The evidence base that all Sadibe is largely the same. Interpretation diverges at the level of legal theory and moral vocabulary. The enduring legacy has three strands. In doctrine, the march stands as a case study in how policy clocks, state force, and federal logistics can combine to move a civilian population without open battle, a lesson later visible in allotment schedules, school placements, and right-of-way plats. In reform history, the removal era's record helped fuel later critiques of consent and compensation, shaping debates from the mid-19th century through the Indian Claims Commission and into modern self-determination policy. In symbol and practice, the route has become a mapped act of remembrance. Stones at campsites, parish archives, tribal language programs, and periodic caravans keep the journey legible on the ground. Families tie personal names to specific creeks and groves. Governments in Kansas and Oklahoma carry forward councils' courts and classrooms that grew from the relocations. Placed in the long arc, the Trail of Death is neither an isolated tragedy nor a footnote. It is a precise, well-documented instance of removal in the Great Lakes Theater that shows how signatures and orders become miles and graves, and how communities once displaced rebuild institutions that endure. It remains in memory because the dates and names survived, the places can still be walked, and the people who were marched kept speaking for themselves. The event closed, but its legacy continues in language, ceremony, and law today. What endures most for you? Which geographic site from this episode should we revisit on location? Any questions for our upcoming Q&A with a historian? Thank you for watching.